Hello, this is Joel Whitney with the Syracuse University College of Law, and I'd like to welcome you to this edition of the New York State Science and Technology Law Center webcast. Today's webcast is hosted by Shubha Ghosh, the Crandall Melvin Professor of Law and Director of the Technology Commercialization Law Center. Shubha?
Yeah, thank you, Joel, and thanks to all the audience who are either listening to us live or listening to the webcast. It's great to do another one of our webinars in the series that kind of looks at different aspects of technology. Today we're going to talk about a very interesting startup called Encrypgen LLC. And basically this is a startup where genomics meets blockchain. And to sort of get into the discussion a little bit, let me introduce our two guests who are joining us remotely. This is as I was saying before we started, this is a NAFTA conference or a NAFTA webinar. We have Vasiliki Rahimzadeh, PhD candidate at McGill University, who is joining us via Adobe Acrobat, the Adobe software from McGill University in Montreal. And then we have David Koepsell, JD PhD, who has roots in Buffalo and I guess in Western New York more broadly. Did his JD and PhD at the University of Buffalo at SUNY. And he's the founder of Encrypgen, and he's joining us from his home office in Mexico City. So, and I'm here in lovely New York, in Syracuse, New York. So we've got the North American segment of the world covered. So welcome, thank you for joining us, and I hope to have a lively discussion. I thought we'd just start by talking a bit about Encrypgen. And so, David, would you like to kind of describe the background to the startup and
Sure.
the kind of things you do? I have a couple of slides. This is a slide I think I took if I'm correct, the mission statement from your website. So
Okay.
people can read this and we can refer to that as well.
All right. Well, just briefly, a little bit of background on how we started and what we're trying to do. My wife, Dr. Vanessa Gonzalez, is a genomic scientist. She actually works at the Mexican National Institute for Genomics. She and I have been collaborating for a number of years on issues of ethics and genomic data. In 2009, a book, my first book on the subject came out. It was Who Owns You? And that was about the patenting of genes, which the book came out just a couple months before the ACLU brought the landmark suit that changed that practice. And more or less adopted the arguments I had made in that book. So, when gene patents stopped, we were interested in questions of privacy of data and also facilitating the use of data in science. And I've been a big proponent of open science and data sharing, and we sought to find a common ground or a way to be able to share data and empower individuals who submit that data and are subjects in studies to have ownership and control of that data. So we looked into blockchain technology. And we've built something called the Gene Chain, which is a blockchain-based platform for the sharing of genomic data in what's called a permission blockchain. And we can get more into the technical details shortly. The point of the platform is to be able to share data among researchers and individuals to give some sort of custodial grant to individuals so that they can take control of that data in some way, and also to create a payment platform for the use of that data. So we were also inspired by the Henrietta Lacks case, which most people have heard of. And we wanted to be able to make sure the next Henrietta Lacks was going to be able to be recompensed somehow for the use of their data in a way that would be more fair than what happened.
Yeah, and so the landmark case that David was referring to is the Myriad decision from the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013, which basically held that naturally occurring gene sequences cannot be patented, even though synthetic sequences could be, and maybe we'll get into that distinction in a little bit. So as the subtitle to today's webinar discuss, that's the genomics part. Vaso, could you tell us a little bit about the blockchain part and how that technology is working? And then we'll move on to how they fit together.
Sure. Well, I think, in fact, David would be best to speak to the technical parts. But what I think is useful here is to explain what features of the blockchain and more generally what they call distributed ledger technologies really afford genomic data sharing and patient data sharing also. So what we're talking about is basically almost a database where you have different people connecting and online into this database, allowed to access, share, see, update data exchanges and information in real time. And so what I think is really the motivating factor for adopting a novel application of the blockchain, like David and others have in patient data, is really this ability to share what many scholars, at least in data protection law and ethicists, feel are data that hold with it a sense of higher sensitivity. So we care about healthcare data because it's identifiable, it says something rather profound about ourselves, and as it differs from trading Bitcoin, there's a social good that's attributed to healthcare data that we want to protect, and the blockchain affords a really unique mechanism for doing that. And what I think I find the most beautiful technical feature of the blockchain is that it's secure because it's open. And what seems to be a bit counterintuitive there, it's the way that the technology operates is allows for people to share data in the most secure way. And so sharing more data means and enabling it to be more open actually enhances its security. And so that's one of the technological advantages in the genomics community. And something that I work on a lot is the ethics of open science. So what are some of the underlying ethical motivations for sharing generally, and again, the blockchain giving us a novel way to do that. And so what many may not know is that there are two sort of dormant rights in the UN Declaration that outline the right of citizens to benefit from science, and its corollary, the right of scientists to be to have adequate attribution of their scientific contributions. So these are two what many people are saying are dormant rights in the UN Declaration, but that are being reanimated and brought to bear on questions of national and jurisdictional priorities of data sharing within the scientific community, and that really play out again rather profoundly in genomics, considering the complexity of the human genome and our ability to, with sound statistical associations, be able to connect genes with human disease. And so no single lone scientist can generate enough of that data alone to make those associations and really push forward with precision medicine, personalized therapies that really require massive amounts of data, massive amounts of volume, of valid data, and data that can be mobilized. And so these are some of the underlying, I think, motivations for adopting a data sharing platform generally, and then some of the technical attributes of the blockchain that allow us to do that. And so really generally, we're talking about decentralized data inputs so that everybody that has access to this ledger or a database can input and access and request information in real time. This data is interoperable, so meaning that when I receive something from another researcher, that it's in the data is in a format that will help me analyze it and use it for whatever purpose I need it and I'm requesting it for. And again, some unique approaches to data securities that I think, again, David would be better suited to speak to the technical aspects. But I think, from some of my reviews or initial reviews of the literature and looking at this in an ethical legal space, there are some conceptual implications for using the blockchain in this way. So I really looking forward to our discussions and hashing those out more thoroughly.
I think it's worth mentioning, and then we can take the discussion from this, that the blockchain is a bit like the internet. I mean, we refer to it as like one homunculus, some autochthonous entity, but it's sort of a network of networks of networks, right? I mean, that's kind of what's interesting. So we clarify. You can clarify this or correct me, but one way to think about it, or at least I think about the blockchain, is that it's sort of a dynamic storage. It's not just simply like iCloud or a storage set where you can keep your data. It allows that storage facility, but it allows the storage facility to be connected among whoever the users might be. And I guess potentially it could be everybody, depending upon what the security clearance is. And Vaso, one of the things that's really interesting is the ability in real time, as you say, to work with the data, to download the data, but the data is sort of still there. But you talk about the openness. Let's take that apart a little bit. I guess it may be open in the sense that there is this access, but I also hear open in terms of transparency, that at least you can see what people are doing and what has been done in the past. And I think the paradox, maybe, at least the way I would see one aspect of the paradox, is everybody's doing stuff with this data that's out there in this network, but the way you kind of authenticate it is that nobody can really, there is this kind of secure system that's out there that allows you to authenticate what's being done, but without, everybody can use the data, analyze it, but the data is there that people can go back and look and understand the transactions. So it's a bit like a bank account. I mean, some of the analogies that have come up that's very similar to what encryption is doing and has done is creating these code banks, right? So there's the Amazon code bank. There's some talk about doing the next generation of the human genome projects for non-human DNA using these types of code banks. So, I'm probably not doing a very good job in capturing what the blockchain is, because it's kind of like just trying to describe what the internet is. I mean, you can sort of say it's a network of networks, and that helps you a little bit. But I think it's probably helpful to say that there isn't one thing that's the blockchain, like there's one giant storage shed. It really is kind of a network of these, dynamic storage systems that, depending upon your access, you can look at the data, work with it, but the data kind of never really changes, but there's really a record of what is happening. Does that help in some way, or how does that, before we kind of move on to some of the more practical details, how does that sound as a description of the blockchain? Either one, whoever.
Yeah, so I often like to use an example with of the blockchain by looking at cuneiform tablets. So the original cuneiform tablets that we're looking at from the ancient Sumerians were records of transactions. Okay, they were just ledgers essentially, and they were clay ledgers, and they were often sealed in a clay capsule. And the point of that was to be able to track the exchange of information or goods in that case. So the blockchain now is more or less like distributing those tablets among a bunch of people who are all supposed to be responsible for any update to those tablets. And you can't go back and change the ledger without breaking it. So the idea of the blockchain is that there has to be consensus for every time you add new data to it. And one of the strengths of blockchains is, as you said, transparency, and another is immutability. So, for instance, if you look at the Bitcoin blockchain, we have a record of every transaction of Bitcoin ever since it began. And each new transaction has to be agreed upon by the entire network, well, by a majority of the network, in order to be added to the ledgers.
Okay. And so Vasa, would you, what What's your assessment of my description of the blockchain?
I'm thinking, you said a few things that were really important, transparency being one of them, and some of the responsibilities or tasks that the blockchain is able to undertake for us. So certainly storage is one of those things, but the use of smart contracts, which some of your students are looking at, is automating executing permissions through parametric code that in real time take us a long time to do. So in order to share patient data, for example, requires a consent document. Consent documents, never could we have imagined we would use and reuse and reanalyze and recombine data in the ways that we have now. Which is a great thing as technology evolves and genome sequencing has sophisticated so much. But the real bottleneck to this is that these patients and these research participants never consented to the use of their data beyond the extent of the study that they were originally part of. So what a smart contract can do is execute these permissions automatically. We encode it. We tell the blockchain and the smart contract to execute sharing and distribution and access to data as per the participant wanted. So in that way, it also acts as a data access officer. And so it stores data, it distributes that data to those that subscribe to the ledger, but it also acts as almost a data access officer by executing these permissions. So it's kind of like a well-oiled machine that is automating tasks that typically take us a long time, that have been stuck in this bureaucratic bottleneck for a very long time, and in that way, I would say it's in a beautiful way is kind of this ecosystem of tasks and permissions and access, along with being a storage facility. And so one of the things that we care about is data security, in the sense that patient data or genomic data is somewhat sensitive because it's identifiable, but the reason data securities exist is to prevent misuse. So what the blockchain affords us is a very, very high computational threshold for misusing. Not only is it so difficult to hack the blockchain, it's almost what it would require to do this, at least on the Bitcoin ledger, is almost mind-boggling to the effort that would need to go into actually hacking it, actually manipulating the individual blocks that store these information exchanges, and permanent. It's why we say it's immutable. It's permanent documentation of data exchanges happening. So a very high computational power to hack it. These third-party participants that authenticate or testify to the integrity of two information exchanges is another feature that's really important and key to the immutability of the blockchain. And then finally, because you have a permanent record of what's happened, let's say in some crazy world that someone was able to hack the blockchain, we would know exactly when and under what circumstances they did it. So we could immediately hold that entity accountable for the misuse, and that checks off all the boxes for why why we have a data security and data protection law in the first place. And so that's where I would respond to you, in that your description is right about storage, and it even goes beyond storage into all these other different responsibilities that can execute automatically.
It's a dynamic storage, a dynamic bank account. The gene bank or the code bank example that I gave with the Amazon. I mean, it sort of kind of brought it to my mind in terms of really understanding what's happening. But there's one question. I mean, David mentioned Henrietta Lacks, and definitely we can see the possibility here to empower patients to see how their data is being used. But what are the incentives for researchers to move into the blockchain? So, for example, with Bitcoin, we talk about the transparency, but without overgeneralizing, but I think this is generally accurate, that a lot of people use Bitcoins because they don't want to use bank accounts. I mean, they want to engage in certain types of transactions that are not transparent in the way that a bank account or traditional bank account would be. And so you've got the Bitcoin, and there's obviously the speculators, that arise there. In smart contracting, you might have a situation where you have sophisticated business parties or whatever they might be that say, okay, I kind of trust you, and I know you kind of trust me, but I kind of don't trust you. So why don't we have a system that kind of is self-reinforcing? So we'll get into it. What keeps, it's not so much hacking, but what keeps certain researchers from saying, well, we feel sorry for the Henrietta Laxes of the world, but we do want to make this data proprietary, and one way to do that is just simply not enter the blockchain at all. Is that possible? I mean, it's not like the Matrix, is it? I never fully understand the Matrix, but I think you could opt out of the Matrix in that movie, right? I haven't watched all three or however many there are, but it seems like you could opt out of the blockchain, right? The real world is still there.
Yeah, there's a number of free and public data sets of genomic data. So the 1,000 Genome Project, the 100,000 Genome Project, the Personal Genome Project, these are all open and free. Anyone can search them. 100,000 Genome Project just reached their 50,000 genome milestone. And yeah, there's a lot of people who are happy to be able to put their data out there, freely searchable by anyone and useful for scientists. And so yeah, that's a sense in which people are opting out of a blockchain type solution and using just a public cloud-based solution. But there's other reasons why people might want to avoid that. So you mentioned, for instance, that there are proprietary data sets. Well, one of those is, for instance, the 23andMe data set. When you get a test done by one of these commercial companies like 23andMe, they keep that data, and they retain contractually the right to resell that data. What we know about the way that they can resell that data and profit from it is that not too long ago they sold an aggregated data set that was used in Parkinson's research. It was bought for, I believe it was $10 million for that data set. And if you break that down on a per person basis, that's $3,000 per person involved in that aggregated data. While you paid 23andMe for the right to get tested by them, and then gave up the ability to profit from the resale of that data. So blockchains are interesting because they afford us a method of tracking of what we think is some of the indicia of ownership and control of that data. Although you're not really able to own the data because there's no current legal framework for owning that sort of data, we have a technical way in which you can exert some of the indicia of ownership by being able to buy and sell and bid and then lock up that data if you prefer. So what is the incentive for researchers? We think there's going to be an emerging market of people who want to get tested, who think that they don't want to end up not profiting by the resale of their data or not even knowing about it. They are going to want to exert some of the indicia of ownership. They're going to want to retain the ability to track that data. And as those, and I think the market is validating this model because since we started Encrypgen, there's about a dozen new companies that have come along that are also trying to build similar products. So time will tell how many people end up putting their data on things like our gene chain. They've started to do so already. We think that is going to be a strong incentive. Accessing that emerging and growing data set is going to be a strong incentive for researchers to get access to that data and then be able to interact with subjects through the blockchain, and also to do, as Vasily mentioned, that we could do a consent procedure through smart contracts, even geolocated, so that it was jurisdictionally appropriate.
And I think part of the Amazon bank that's being developed for genomic information from the rainforest to develop sort of traditional knowledge databases has that geolocating, because I think Vasa referred to some of the international treaties, Nagoya Protocol, for example, the treaties involving biomaterials and biological resources. There's this question of compliance, and the blockchain technology could focus on that, as you mentioned. That's an interesting point. So Vasa, what's your sense about the incentives? Will people just move into the blockchain? Is it kind of like the incentives to move into the internet way back in the 1980s? It just sort of happened and it became kind of a fad, and then suddenly everybody was on it one day?
I think the blockchain, the incentives to share on the blockchain follow from the incentive to share data in the first place. And there are a few both forced as well as punitive incentives to share data. The first being, if you hold an NIH grant of more than $500,000, you're required to share your data in whatever form and function you can find. So on dbGaP, for example, is another big database. The 100,000 Genomes Project also so these are different databases, open source databases that count towards your data sharing plan as part of the requirements of holding your funding. So that's one of them. I think that what the blockchain, then sharing via the blockchain, allows researchers to do is eliminate some of the practical challenges of sharing their data. So there are big technical demands on researchers to share their data. They have to standardize it in a certain way according to the formats of those open source platforms. This takes a lot of time and money. It also requires human resources. So most genomic researchers are not bioinformaticians. They're also not statisticians per se. And they're also not computer scientists, and so a lot of these interdisciplinary teams are needing to come to force because of these data science expertise that's needed. So I think the blockchain enables or at least streamlines some of that process in particular. Also eliminating the middleman. So you're eliminating this centralized database and allowing researchers to share data directly from source to beneficiary. And I think that's a really new, novel kind of form of data sharing that blockchain enables. And really, we can't underestimate the timeliness of this. So I think the Bitcoin ledger, correct me if I'm wrong, David, is updated every 10 minutes. Imagine if researchers could have access to new genomic associations, novel findings, novel discoveries every 10 minutes. What that would do to the translational process of discovery to application to implementation in the clinical setting is really profound. And so that's where I would see some of the incentives from a technical side. And on an ideological side, David was talking a lot about tracking. So tracking, we spoke about it a bit in terms of data misuse, but tracking is also addressing what I would argue is a very long-standing cultural or anti-sharing culture that happens in the genomics community in particular. And this is the way that publication is set up. It's the way that publication is the currency of academic credit in our field, and so sharing data almost stands in contrast to personal benefit. So I think this is one of the systemic cultural challenges that underlie data sharing in general, and then adding a tracking mechanism would allow researchers to cite data sets much easier. They'd able to give, in pursuant to that second human rights that I talked about, attributing scientific attribution, appropriate scientific attribution. The tracking system of the blockchain allows us to do that too.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing, and I think these are important points to emphasize before we move on to some other topics, that there's either for cultural reasons or for regulatory reasons a need for data sharing. And we therefore then need some sort of mechanism to make that data sharing possible. And what the blockchain is doing is creating sort of a commons-like system, to invoke Eleanor Ostrom here, that allows that data sharing to occur in an effective, I'm not going to use the word efficient, but an effective, equitable, dynamic sort of way. And that's what I want to take apart a little bit to see how that's developing. But I mean, one analogy, to think about here in terms of the incentives and the way in which the blockchain gets adopted is I guess we could have some sort of a certification mechanism that says, this database or this data that's being collected is blockchain certified. But that seems to defy the decentralized notion of this. So it's a bit like PayPal or other kind of electronic payment mechanisms, in the sense that companies or other entities that are online eventually sort of adopt PayPal or Venmo or whatever the system might be in order to facilitate this, and consumers see it and they gravitate towards those types of sites that allow for those types of payments and then move away. So there's the decentralized aspect in which things like PayPal get adopted. But with the data sharing culture, if you will, the data sharing market, if you want to even use that analogy, it's even more decentralized because there's so many interests. And one of the things that Vasa mentioned that's interesting is about the research culture. I know at least in economics and finance journals, there is a requirement among some of the more prominent ones, that you do have to make your data sets available for replication. I don't know how far that's gone, and has that occurred also in the natural sciences, Vaso?
Those are requirements, and they're part of good scientific practice. But I would argue they aren't met with accountability mechanisms. So there was a recent, I think it was just last week, article in the BMJ where they did a systematic review of all studies that were eligible or that were required to share data as a condition of funding. Either so NIH has this policy, but I believe the NHS does also, or Wellcome Trust, or big funders in the UK also have this data sharing mandate, and found, abysmally 43% were actually sharing their data in the ways that were required by the funder. So I think it's this not necessarily the sharing part itself, but the accountability or mechanism to record or track or verify that sharing is happening in the way that's required. Yeah, I think one of the incentives being that tracking part, it would address a major reason why what I think at least genomic scientists or biomedical scientists aren't sharing data. And by the way, this is almost unique to biomedical science in particular, because the best data sharers, in my opinion, are astrophysicists. And I've been, this is kind of another paper that's floating in my mind about why is it that the astrophysics community and the astronomy community are premier sharers. And I think part of it has to do with this notion of having to share resources. So you can't necessarily sequence, you sequence a person and you get this genome, or you have open source access to genomes via the platforms we've been talking about. But astrophysicists have to go to a telescope, and that is a shared resource that it's almost like implicit sharing is part of their day to day. And so I think there's a lot to be learned. When I say natural sciences, I really I think that genomics and biomedical research is kind of in its own category of bad data sharing practice, because there are other scientists that are doing this much better than we are, and have been for quite some time. And so the tracking mechanism, I think it really cuts down at a very core piece of why people don't share in the first place, which is this attribution thing, and having your data set be cited in papers, and getting that kind of attribution for all the effort it took to collect, analyze, store, and then share to the rest of the community.
Yeah, I mean, you also have a lot of crowdsourcing in the astrophysics area, right? People who are scanning. I mean, it's a classic example of a public good. It's also an example where I have to go back and remind myself of the statute, but I think inventions in outer space or discoveries in outer space have been exempted from U.S. intellectual property laws. So it's kind of interesting, an area where patents have left it to the commons, the research commons. And so this now gets us back to Encrypgen a little bit, that maybe one of the reasons, as Vaso has pointed out, where genomics has not had that culture of sharing maybe until recently, is because of the way in which the Human Genome Project played out in various ways, as well as the decision to allow patenting of genomic sequences. So this gets us to this slide. This is a slide courtesy of David from his slide deck that he shared with us. And this is the Myriad case once again. So there's a decision 2013 and 14, just to remind folks, from U.S. and Australian Supreme Courts. And for various reasons, but I think there's some convergence here in the policy, that the isolation of naturally occurring genes did not allow for patenting, right? And so, again, the emphasis here is on naturally occurring genes, and this then opens up the possibility for data sharing for naturally occurring genes, even though at least the U.S. decision opened up or left open this question about synthetic DNA. In some ways, it may have even left open the question about non-human DNA, but I think the language of the case is fairly broad to cover non-human DNA. I've done some independent research on Myriad. One of the things that's very interesting about Myriad, and Myriad, the company, the Utah company, when this decision came out from the U.S. Supreme Court, they didn't seem to be very fazed by it. In fact, the company, that sort of relied upon isolating DNA sequences and then creating therapies based upon it for ovarian cancer and breast cancer, seemed to do better. And one of the things I was finding is that if you look at Myriad's patenting patterns, even leading up to the 2013 decision, but certainly afterwards, is they're now going into this data analytics space for patenting. It's not really about isolating DNA sequences for that company. It's about, doing what, if you look at Microsoft's patents or Google's patents, a lot of patents in mapping software and data analytics for that type of information. Myriad is now patenting it in that area. And so that's why a company like Encrypgen is fairly exciting, and the blockchain technology is very exciting because it's offering an alternative to what I envision Myriad might be thinking, and other companies are thinking about having more of a proprietary data analytics system. So why don't we talk about that, if that's okay? I think there's some really interesting issues there about how Encrypgen and blockchain might work here. And so, as David phrased it in this slide, once you have the naturally occurring DNA sequences being in the public domain, how do you guard genetic privacy and create some means of ownership and control? So this is where the genes and money aspect come in. I mean, the way in which we create a commons system. So Vaso has talked a little bit about smart contracts, and I want to get back to that in this context. But David, could you talk a little bit about, I know you can't talk about specific customers for your software, but can you sort of give a general sense of the landscape about companies that are coming to you and seeing the need and finding your company meeting the need, and how then we have this kind of market being created?
Sure. So actually, it's a really varied group that's interested in the technology, ranging from pharmaceutical companies to small biotech startups to individuals who are interested in having alternatives to things like 23andMe. And the way we view it is that we're creating a sort of another commons. The commons is anything you decide to open to use by some group of individuals, and you can set rules for how that use occurs. So, in our case, we're creating a sort of permissioned, as I said before, it's a permissioned commons. You have to have a license to search for and buy the data on the gene chain. But anybody can put the data out there. So it's a hybrid concept. So if you go ahead and use one of our preferred vendors to get a test done, they've agreed not to hold that data for themselves. They've agreed to let you have that data, and you can choose to put it up on the gene chain. And there you can either opt in to release it to the commons, the scientific commons who joins that chain, for research, and then get paid for it if you want. Or you can just keep it there for, say, storage and share it just with your doctor or genetic counselor. So one of the concerns that people have is being able to use that data in a way that helps their own healthcare, that it allows them to get informed about that data, and then also to be able to make sure that it's not hacked. So, as people have become more familiar with some of the higher profile data hacks and cloud-based services, people are becoming a little more familiar with the merit of things like Bitcoin. The blockchain itself has never been hacked, although various wallets and exchanges have been. And recognizing that it's a way to help guard against that sort of malicious action. Now, one of the things that we also, blockchains are also good at providing is methods of payment. So to varying degrees, most blockchains are some sort of financial transaction network. Something like Ethereum is again a hybrid sort of blockchain that allows for payments and programming of, as Vasiliki mentioned, smart contracts. So you can put some functionality in there, and it's a real platform. And this is an interesting additional use for us and for our users, the ability to transact business about genes and have a method of payment. We have a token on the network that is used as the mechanism of exchange. And we can also provide complete transparency about those exchanges as well.
No, interesting. So before, Vasil, I want to follow up with this on as far as smart contracts. Before I do so, to those who are listening, and we have a few people who are listening, if you have any questions, please, I think you have the capacity to type them into your window, and I'll definitely pursue them. So please do so. We look forward to your questions. So Vasil, do you want to talk a little bit about smart contracts? You mentioned those before. How do they function exactly within the blockchain technologies?
Right. So the way that I understand it being particularly applicable in the genomic or patient data sharing context are as certain landmarks in this data generation, data contribution, data generation, analysis, and sharing spectrum. There are points within that landmark and that timeline at which we require, both legally and from a regulatory standpoint, the permissions, the consent, the data protection and securities standards for entering into the next phase of that timeline. And so these are the landmarks that vary in time as well as form, that a smart contract can intervene and, as I mentioned before, automate and execute those permissions as per the legal and regulatory requirements in the jurisdiction that data is being contributed and generated. So one, at the very onset of that timeline is patient consent, is permissions. And this is something I've been thinking a bit about and have had quite a few questions from blockchain enthusiasts or researchers that are interested in how they might share their data better on the blockchain, is do we enact or give patients the every single time a researcher wants to use their data, do we have to consent the patient to do that? I think my intuitive answer would hopefully be no, because this is what we're dealing with currently. So the secondary use clauses in paper consent forms, we just transfer into a digital form, and that's not what we want. But what I envision a smart contract doing is a patient being allowed to determine for themselves the extent to which they want their data shared, either to a specific researcher, a specific research institution, a field of research, let's say, or what is now encompassing all of those in broad consent. So a patient that's consenting to the sharing of their data in any form or function, recombination, reanalyzed, and across the world. And so I see the smart contract being able to execute those permissions without having to go back to the patient to reconsent every time. I also see it in replacing material transfer agreements. And so these are agreements that are between institutions that are required by data access officers and data access committees to gain permission from the institution and then from the jurisdiction to send data elsewhere for an approved purpose or use. And so I see the smart contract really revolutionizing that process, which takes time and human resources and energy to approve those. And then finally, smart contracts can be used by funders and institutions to keep track of the data that's coming out of their institutions and how that data is then being mobilized and informing different discoveries, different policies. And so I see these different landmarks on the continuum of data generation to data sharing that a smart contract could be useful. And another topic we've been sort of dancing around but haven't quite named is this field of citizen science and the idea that patients and participants are not subjects but are active agents in the research process, that handing that sort of smart contracts almost through a physical entity hands that kind of agency over to participants and connects directly participant to researcher. And I think that's a really unique thing that the blockchain enables and again addresses a long-standing ideal that we've had for a very long time about wanting participants to be actively engaged in the research process, that they're not merely subjects upon which we do research, but rather active agents alongside. As we have funding through taxpayer dollars, there's an implicit priority delivering on priorities that we have to the public and the social good. So I think, in even ideological ways, a smart contract addresses a lot of those.
Yeah. And so there are a couple of points. David, did you want to add something, or?
Yeah, because I think Vasiliki mentioned her point about this reconsenting issue. It's going to become very important with the new GDPR in Europe, because under the GDPR, you're going to need a consent every time somebody decides to use a piece of data that you've submitted in the past. So a smart contract would be one way and it isn't in the GDPR now, but if it's interpreted to be able to provide the appropriate consent, and then that will facilitate further use of the data in a lot more fluid manner than it would if people actually had to go back and consent each time, without a smart contract. So that's one point. And regarding the citizen science point, which is really interesting, is because blockchains are able to disintermediate some central authority, they really can hook up researchers with each other and subjects who are going to possibly be researchers too. with one another, to share data, to use and understand their own data, and to play with that data. So, and the beauty of that is that under a blockchain system, you're able to track those uses in a way that, right now, garage biohackers are not being tracked, for instance.
Yeah, let me ask two follow-ups. One about the underlying technology or the limits of it, and then the second about the citizen researcher. So the first one, I think it's important that you have the data sharing. Obviously, I don't think anybody can deny it. But is there anything within blockchain that says you have to share the results of your analysis? So, for example, there's the big issue in open science about negative results as well as positive results. As I'm listening to this and as I've read in this area, it seems it's a lot about tracking the use of data, at least in terms of identifying when it was used. But what about results? I mean, that still can be proprietary. Am I correct about that, or?
It could be, but I was thinking about the Millikan case. The Nobel Prize winning physicist who discovered the charge of the electron, and I used that a lot when I was teaching ethics and technology. And of course, he didn't keep he didn't report all his data. But what if you were able to hook up, and there are blockchains that are intended to be able to, and I think could be put to use to solve issues like that. There's something called the Internet IOTA, which is an Internet of Things blockchain. If you could ensure that every new machine, right, that measures something, submitted its results to a blockchain, then you would be able to avoid things like that, where a researcher omits results. If you could log every single result from some measuring device on a blockchain, then you have perfect transparency about those results as well. And I think that is a very good likelihood in the near future as a use for blockchains in science. And it would solve a lot of these sorts of issues that Millikan and others have been accused of in the past.
Vasa, what's your sense of result? Isn't one of the problems with that potentially, as David described it, is just more information overload? I mean, there is a sense of privacy, if you will, for lack of a better term, that a researcher would like, right? The researcher doesn't necessarily want to see, for example, every mistake or every flop experiment. Obviously, there's a value in detecting, hidden experiments or hidden results. But we don't necessarily want every aspect of what goes on in a lab to be monitored that closely, do we?
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think on both sides of the coin here, there are advantages, but some marked disadvantages. And the first, obviously, the obvious ones being the imperative to reproduce scientific findings from raw data. That's as part of good scientific practice. Then from a results standpoint, we have a huge epidemic really in the scientific community of data fabrication and falsification. This would cut down directly on that too. One of the things we haven't talked about yet, and as we keep adding all these novel ways that the blockchain can help us do science better, there are some limitations to even the blockchain's ability to do that. And one of the major ones at least one of the major oppositions to all these really, what we're talking about, really cool uses of blockchain has to do, comes from the environmentalist community, that the computational power needed to run blockchains to do all of the things we're talking about are huge. And where that require building huge servers and lots of people doing things on the internet at the same time, and really some of the loudest opposition has come from groups, environmental groups like this. And so, it would be interesting that you're competing. You have two almost competing scientific values. One being the ability to do good science through reproducibility and all of the virtues that the blockchain can deliver on, while at the same time dealing with a very real climate change warriors that say this is only going to exacerbate what we've already done to our planet. And so I think that discourse has been really interesting to follow. And I don't know really the rights approach to go from there, and I know there's been different protocols to try to limit the kind of storage and distribution of information, but I think this is something we haven't quite been able to solve in adopting these new applications that we're discussing.
Yeah, and on the citizen science or citizen researcher side, well, I mean, especially in the climate that we're in now, at least in the U.S., is there a risk? I think there would be a risk of patients not agreeing. I mean, can they veto to say, I don't want my data to be used for research that I don't agree with on ethical grounds or religious grounds or moral grounds? Is there something within the blockchain? It seems like within the blockchain technologies, as I'm hearing, that would totally be feasible. I mean, to what extent are, on the one hand, patients are empowered to get money, but that empowerment also gives them the ability to potentially, the individual patient might not have the power, but you can imagine groups of patients getting together and saying, oh, I don't want this particular researcher or group of researchers to use my data in this way.
Yeah, and the only way we can know something about that is through the available evidence we have on public perception. And so in that field, what seems to be coming out is that patients, and in particular, I'll use a case example from my own work in rare disease, their concept of privacy and confidentiality is almost none, in the sense that their conditions are so rare that there's only one or two people in the world that can share in that kind of genotypic and phenotypic profile, that your only option to getting any sort of diagnosis or information on your condition is to share data and share it so widely that person across the world will somehow, shape, or form find you. And so that there's these different conceptions of privacy, and that I think different patient communities adopt and are unique to their patient community. And so I think on the same token, some of the main reasons why people don't allow sharing of their data beyond the clinical encounter or the specific research study they're participating in has to do with third-party misuse. This is particularly in the United States, where insurers have, under GINA, of course, are protected from denying coverage based on pre-existing conditions, but it hasn't appeased the public to the extent that they are still they're still fearful to share their data widely in that way. So if we can communicate to people that the blockchain can address some of the securities challenges we have, if we can ensure that their information, their altruism really to donate and share their data to science won't be used against them. These are key messages that the public needs to hear in order to make that sort of sharing more widespread.
Yeah. So David, I mean, in terms of how the software is designed, your specific one or in general, for these types of technologies, is it just if somebody wants to buy, somebody has to sell the data, or are there ways for patients to opt out because they have their own objections to certain areas of research? Or I know this is more than just simply a question of software design, but the software can either prevent certain things or allow certain things. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So there's no reason you couldn't opt out under certain conditions or for certain types of clients. So again, this is where a smart contract could be useful to be able to ensure that when somebody does buy, it's only under various conditions that you've already pre-consented to.
Okay. And so you can have very individualized, tailored contracts for different patients, depending upon how the patient is negotiating, if you will, with the researcher or the hospital or the doctor.
Yeah, I think that's the likely future of that sort of market.
Okay. Well, we're coming across the hour, and there are just a lot of questions. I know we can have a lot more discussion. I appreciate both of you taking the time, and I hope the audience, both live and who are listening to this on recording, have found this a good introduction to blockchain technologies and the specific applications to genomics. Are there, final words that you have, David, starting with you, David, and then we'll go to Vaso, that you'd want to kind of leave listeners with in terms of the future of the technology or policy issues that we haven't touched upon?
Yeah, I think just one point about something that Vasil mentioned is that the energy footprint of blockchains. And that is a significant issue with some blockchain technologies. We have chosen, as a response to that, to use one called multi-chain, which is a very low energy footprint. It's and there's dozens of new types of blockchain technologies that are either in production or already out there that have lower energy footprints. And I think we do have a responsibility to try to find solutions that fulfill the goals and the philosophical bases of decentralization and disintermediation that blockchain promises in a way that's environmentally and socially responsible. And that's I think what we're trying to do, and I believe that's also part of the future of blockchain and sciences.
Vasa, you have the actual final word, or words.
The pressure is on. No, I totally echo those sentiments, and I think what this example of marrying what a technology or an innovation that came out of finance to science and genomics and biomedical research is a beautiful example of this cross-disciplinary work and language speaking and discourse that needs to happen more often. So blockchain has been around for quite a number of years before we even and are now just sort of learning about it quite late in the game. And so I think what's a really amazing example is that these are two communities, otherwise disparate communities, coming together where we have a significant problem to solve, and there is a very viable technological solution to solve it. And that only comes with this sort of discourses and opportunities for cross-dialogue like you've fostered today, Professor Ghosh, and I would just really encourage those conversations to continue happening and to open up new doors for that kind of dialogue and cross discussions. And so I think one of the major areas, which is why I'm so interested in, is in now the governance of the blockchain, and in saying that should there be a certain governance quid pro quo of the blockchain. I'm not sure, but I think the notion of sharing healthcare data as different from finance data underscores the need for a bit of oversight, ethics oversight, or regulatory oversight, and how that fits within the decentralized modus operandi of the blockchain is yet to be seen. But I think with getting the right minds across the table, we can certainly start to address some of those.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank both of you, both Dr. Koepsell and Dr. Rahimzadeh, for joining us. This is actually the start of a conversation, even though we're ending right now, and I really think it's a great start. And I hope to have it within these webinar series or maybe other programs at Syracuse College of Law in the future. So thank you very much. For those who are listening to this on the YouTube channel, you can find further resources below, below near the comment section on the YouTube page. And we'll have some links to various things, especially some interesting interviews with Dr. Koepsell about his startup and maybe the link to his startup page as well. So thank you again, and thank you for listening. Our next webinar will be scheduled for March 21st, and we will have Professor Erica Lightson from the University of Missouri College of Law. She's also a partner at Covington and Burling, who will talk about her work in FDA regulation and orphan drugs. So look for that in about a month. And we also are in the process of planning a half-day seminar on April 25th on technological and policy issues surrounding climate change. And I'll be glad to share further information about that with anybody who's interested. So thanks again to Professor Koepsell, to Dr. Rahimzadeh, and thanks to the audience for listening.